Okay, everyone, I have Nicolas Shadid here, as mentioned, to give us a little talk. I let him know that our class today was on politics of global governance. So we just ended talking about China and the rise of China in global politics and economics. And so he is going to give us a little bit of information on China specifically. Nick comes from a background in international relations that he did in China. He also worked in China and then came here to finish his PhD in the School of Life Sciences, where he works on emerging tech, China, and personhood issues. So anyway, I'm going to have him talk for a little bit, and then I will ask him some follow-up questions to try to give you guys a really rich background on China. I think this is really valuable because China is a really big player, especially in emerging tech and governance, and it often isn't captured, and it certainly isn't captured by someone who's kind of lived through some of the experiences and can give really great, amazing firsthand knowledge. So I will turn it over to Nick to give a little bit more background about what his initial thoughts are, and then I'll ask questions.
Yeah, so hey everybody, just to expand a little bit on my background and relevance to the subject matter. I've been working in China since 2006 on different projects. My first projects involved minority policy and human trafficking in the southwest part of China in the Yunnan province. I then moved into more environmentally focused research. I spent 5 years in the graduate school at Renmin University of China, studying international politics and diplomacy. And then I was lucky enough to get a position at a Chinese material science company where I could do research and work at the same time. I was part of a team that was involved in turning this formerly state-owned enterprise into an internationalized multinational corporation. It was designated as one of these flagship high-tech strategic enterprises, and one that they wanted to turn into something that could compete globally. So that was a really good experience. And then I ended up hooking up with a documentary crew who was working on biotech related things, specifically CRISPR. And my role was to coordinate work on the Chinese side, specifically interviews with researchers who do human genome editing. During that time, I was able to kind of get involved in that world and had some interesting experiences. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that today. But now I'm at ASU. I study emerging biotechnology and the regulatory, ethical, and legal issues surrounding them in China, and how that fits into the kind of international space in emerging technology. So.
Wonderful. Okay, so I first wanted you, I know you have a great story about being involved with the CRISPR babies, and we've kind of already highlighted that story. They know some of the background, and I just think I worked on that academically before I met you, and a lot of what you explained to me was so important in my understanding and changed a lot of my perspective on it. So I thought maybe if you wouldn't mind, you could tell them that story and kind of maybe use that as a way to explain a little bit about how China works and how they see their role in this.
Right. So, there's a lot of facets to that story that are interesting for extrapolating to kind of the global sphere. I'm going to focus more on the regulatory side of things because other people will probably think about with you ethical implications for the future of the human, things like that. But potentially what I can provide is maybe a perspective on how that whole case illustrates China's way of regulating emerging biotechnology and the way of positioning themselves within global biotech competition, which can then, those lessons can be then applied to other technologies. So just to run through the basic facts of the case, I know you guys probably already know, a Chinese scientist who was really he's a biophysicist. his competencies were in genome sequencing and analysis, decided to use CRISPR technology to do germline editing, which is editing of embryos for various purposes. When the news broke, that set off a firestorm. The timing of it was such that the news broke right before the Human Genome Editing Summit that was going to
And you
happen.
had something to do with the story breaking, right?
Right. So I guess, so the story behind it is, as I said, I was working on this documentary. I was coordinating work in interviewing researchers who were doing this type of work. And the documentary crew just happened to be in the right place at the right time. We got to know the actual scientists, known colloquially as JK, that's his nickname. We interviewed him about a month before the summit. The guy I was working with in China, his name is Antonio Regalado. He works for MIT Technology Review. He was with us. He became very suspicious of this guy after the interview. And so he and I worked together for the next couple weeks. And eventually Antonio figured out, because he found a form on the ethics, an ethical release form for the study. He found it online. I translated it for him so he knew what it was saying. And he figured out, oh, turns out they're actually doing this. It's not just theory. It's not just thinking about the future. They've actually done this. So he and I ended up working on that story. It came out on a Sunday night before the conference was on a Monday. And so that kind of blew everything open. And so then I worked subsequently for the next week or two, writing stories with Antonio about the fallout and other things there. So I had a little bit of a personal connection with breaking that story. And part of the story that we'll talk about is, the timing of doing that is, in fact, had a huge impact on how the regulations eventually worked out in the end. Had things happened differently, I think the regulatory frameworks that are now in place in China may have been quite a bit different. But to get back to kind of the regulatory side of this, a lot of the questions about the CRISPR babies thing was, how could this happen given the regulatory framework in China? So in 2003, there was a joint set of guidelines put out by the National Health Commission and the Ministry of Science and Technology that would ostensibly ban exactly what had happened in the CRISPR babies case. The language in that set of guidelines said that no human embryo that's been manipulated can be implanted into a human after 14 days. So they had this 14-day rule. You have to destroy the embryos, and it seemed to preclude that. So the questions are, who is this guy? Is he a rogue scientist? Is he just somebody who's flouting the rules? Why would he do that? It seemed odd. One of the things that most Chinese scholars and Chinese scientists would talk about after this is that it was eminently clear to them that what he did was illegal. In fact, there was a communique that was put out by Chinese scientists just within a few days of the story breaking that called him crazy, called him a Frankenstein, said that it was illegal and that this guy shouldn't be considered a representative of the way things were done in China, because they were playing by the rules of international science. They were also playing by the rules of what they thought were Chinese science regulations, which would preclude this. So the question is, why would he do this? From the research I've done and from working in this space for a long time, it seems clear that a lot of this actually has to do with the way China regulates emerging technology and technology in general. So something that's often missed in understanding China's regulatory system is how, in fact, complex and devolved it is. So prior to the 1980s, China was a kind of what's often called a command economy, or a centralized command system where the central government puts out policy dictates and everybody else is responsible for implementing them later on. Then it turned into a kind of a hybrid system where, in order to join up with the international system and be able to do trade and to do diplomacy and things like that, that type of command market economy needed to be opened up. This is called the Reform and Opening Up movement that was started by, during that time, Deng Xiaoping. So things started to relax. Some market forces were introduced into the economy. Some social policies were privatized. Some other things, a lot of power was devolved to the provinces, but the central government still kept its authority to dictate things. And now we're in a kind of a phase that's called the socialist market economy, which is the utilization of market forces in a centrally dictated manner. So when appropriate, the market comes in order to make industries more competitive, in order to make sure that industries can be effective. So that's kind of the canon way of thinking about it. But in fact, it's a really, if you take that at face value, you're going to miss a lot of the things that made the CRISPR story so interesting. Because in fact, what's really going on in China is not this kind of easy narrative about the government sets priorities and then people implement them, and that's basically how you get from A to B. In fact, there's this kind of process-oriented way of looking at things that makes the story more interesting. It also makes China's place in the world and emerging technologies make a lot more sense. So I would contend that the best way to think about how China regulates, and especially in emerging technologies and strategic industries and things like that, is in this kind of what I think of as the centralized provincial cycle, which is basically the central government, who is led by the CCP, comes up with a forecast for the future and said, okay, the future is going to be this way, so we need policies that are going to position us in the best way possible in order to capitalize on how the future is going to be. And they put out vague statements about this. Like, for example, in biotech is going to be super important. The market is going to be really important for the economy. Therefore, we need industries to support China's position in that. We need technologies that put us at the forefront of biotechnology, blah, blah, blah. And they signal this to the country at large, including industry, markets, provincial authorities, local authorities. Anybody who's involved in this particular area gets a very vague, very general signal about what the central leadership thinks the future is going to be like. That signals to local authorities and provincial authorities in industry that eventually the central government is going to provide a policy framework to support their vision of China in this particular area. But those policies are not spelled out. And then begins a competition at the lower levels to figure out who's going to be positioned best to take advantage of those policies when they come into effect. So then you get a lot of wrangling, you get a lot of new investment in different areas, you get local policies that are kind of predictions of what maybe the future national policy is going to be like. And so you get a very disuniform set of policies and set of strategies at the local level where people are doing all kinds of different things, and it makes Western analysts crazy trying to figure out what's happening, because it just seems ad hoc. It seems like there's no coordination. It seems like there's nothing. Like, what on earth is going on? That happens for a few years, and during that time, the central government is watching to figure out who the winners are and who can best represent ways to fulfill the original vision that we talked about earlier. And in that process of picking who the winners are going to be, then some concrete policies start to emerge. And during this time, what happens is the central government will typically call a conference, and the conference will invite these people who have been successful in their local policies or what they're doing. And also in industry leaders will come, and they'll formulate what's called a draft plan. And this draft plan is basically the birth of what will eventually become a national policy. And it's highly influenced by what you would call experts. In biotechnology, you're gonna get the professors, you're gonna get the biotech entrepreneurs. All these stakeholders are coming together, and they're gonna create another general but more concrete draft policy. So for example, in 2017, China put out its National Biotechnology Strategic Plan draft policy. And mind you, this is before the CRISPR babies. This draft policy is just a short document with some general policies that are being proposed that might support the vision that was laid out years earlier. And this draft policy is then commented on. It's circulated to experts, it's circulated around to provincial authorities, people commented on this. Then a new period of wrangling begins. And then, so that'll go through another process. During this time is when the central government is opening up what are called, sometimes they're called pilot zones, sometimes they're called experimental zones, but basically what they are is they find locations that are of maybe strategic importance where they can enact policies that are different from anywhere in China. So for example, and what is important for the CRISPR babies case is in the southern part of China, there was the creation of a special pilot zone that had preferential policies for things like stem cell research, regenerative medicine, artificial reproductive technologies, where the regulations in place in that specific area made it so that biotechnology research and industry could operate in ways that are in fact illegal in other places in China. This is another signal. This is a signal to scientists involved that things are going to be changing soon. Here's an area where we are going to figure out if it's practicable, if this is going to work. Is this going to cause social instability? Is this going to cause bad effects that we don't want? They can shut it down at any time, but it's an experiment in new policy. This is not something that was ignored by JK, the people who are doing the CRISPR babies research. It was very obvious to people involved in the space that regulations were going to be changing. China had said, we want to dominate biotechnology. We want to dominate human genome editing. There were a lot of grants given out for human germline genome editing projects like embryo editing and different things. In addition to that, there were other government priorities like improving population quality, dealing with infectious diseases, things like that. And so what's really going on here is that it's not just a rogue scientist who decided he was going to use a technology to get famous, to get a Nobel Prize, although that might have been part of the calculus. What's really, for our purposes, important is that he aligned himself with local authorities, again, local authorities, to kind of predict where policy was going to go and get ahead of it, be that player, be that success story that was then going to be handpicked to be the leader of a strategic industry. So in my view, it's the way the regulatory process happens that really incentivized the expectation that the regulations that were in place, and mind you, these are called guidelines. China, there's a hierarchical system of law. There's the specific centralized law, which includes criminal law, civil law, and the Constitution, which is the top. Then there are the laws of administrative agencies, and then there are the guidelines that are put out, and each thing above it can cancel out the other. So given that the vision of the central leadership was going to be China dominating biotech, they made a calculation that maybe this third tier guideline was in fact going to be overruled now that we're having these preferential policies in specific places. Maybe we can jump out ahead and position ourselves in the right way. In my estimation, it was the furor over the international response to this, the idea that this is an abomination to at this stage, when we don't even know the safety risks, to edit embryos and actually produce children. It was that attention on China, that increased scrutiny, that threatened, in fact, the vision of global biotech dominance, that created the reaction that may not have been there had the news not been so widely shared. The consequences of that are the induction in civil law of a statute against the manipulation of the human embryo for implantation, and then later on the amendment of the criminal law code, which made it a criminal offense to manipulate a human embryo and implant it. So basically it was a ban on human genome germline editing that came out of that. That's by no means a reflection of a political ethos, a cultural ethos. That may in fact be, you need a historical explanation. You need to understand how the regulatory process happens to get there. So I think the CRISPR babies case, as far as how China regulates its economy, how it promotes and supports emerging technologies, I think it's best to understand it that way, instead of focusing only on maybe the ethical side of things, and that it's just obvious to everybody that we shouldn't be doing this, and then China needed to get on board. So I hope that narrative can fill out a little bit more of the story and help you place this in a regulatory system that's kind of not familiar and difficult to parse from a Western perspective.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And every time we talk about it, I think I learn something new. And I think it's, like I said, it's really helpful. I worked on this in many ways, and you're always able to give kind of a perspective that I think is needed for Western scholars when trying to understand how to work in this space. So I will ask you a few questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
What do you think US scholars, you could say scholars, media, either way, kind of get wrong about China and maybe and governing China, or working with China, or working against China?
It's a difficult question. Maybe not what scholars get wrong, but maybe what's passed over, not given its due importance, which is, I guess, what I shared earlier, which is this kind of pragmatic regulatory process that happens. You know, when we look back at regulation, it just seems like it appeared out of nowhere sometimes, and that it's due to kind of unchangeable political or cultural touchstones. I think what's really needed for understanding China is that you're not going to be able to predict where they're going to go with regulation until you understand how it starts off early, then becomes a local thing, then it goes through this kind of long drawn out process where really in the end it's a pragmatic approach. It seems odd because we think of China it's led by a communist party. They're trying to do socialism with Chinese characteristics, and that's hard to figure out. But in fact, China is very pragmatic about how it regulates. And a lot of that is due to the fact that in the early stages, Deng Xiaoping, he had a vision of the future and China's place in it. His vision was, we're going to have 50 to 75 years of peace due to the fact that the US is a hegemonic global power. The world system is going to be led by the US, the rules are going to be in place. This is a time when China can develop its economy in order to become a great world power within a period of low conflict. And he said, we can't be just blindly following ideology to get there. We need to be pragmatic about that. So pragmatism is really at the heart of Chinese regulation, and pragmatism is implemented through the use of preferential policies in very specific locales. And if you do, as people looking at maybe international regulation or maybe international business or whatever, if the action is really at these local areas where new things are tried out, where entrepreneurs, whether it's political entrepreneur or somebody in industry, can try to position themselves in a way that I can show that I'm successful in what I'm going for, and I'm doing it in a way that furthers China's strategic goals. There's always the strategic element. Everybody who's competing in China is trying to fit whatever they're doing into the larger strategic framework, or at least narrate it that way. But that's kind of lost in a lot of the discourse surrounding the socialist market economy. It's seen as top down, it's seen as A to B. Right. It's messier. It's much more pragmatic than you would expect.
Maybe to that point, I'll follow up with one thing I found interesting when I started doing comparative work with China was that we kind of discussed with the class that the EU compared to the US, the EU tends to be a little bit more precautionary principle versus the US is a little bit more run by innovation first. That China actually copies a lot of EU primarily. And if you could just kind of briefly go why, because I think a lot of people find that, I don't know, shocking. Maybe they think.
Sure. Yeah. So for example, like in environmental policy, what I used to study, China's environmental policy is basically patterned after the EU. Mm-hmm. Or if you want to think on information technology policy, the GDPR in the EU was very influential in how China does its information security. And I think a lot of that is due to what you could call a regulatory ethos. Mm-hmm. The European regulatory ethos is one where the state is responsible for providing for the social good, and that extends into how industry and the market is organized. In the United States, the ethos is different in that, at least since the 1980s, it's the market who can best provide for the common good, and therefore the state is always in the way of that. Regulation, figuring out what the appropriate regulations are, is about figuring out how to best mobilize private interests in providing for the common good. So the Chinese ethos specifically in Chinese style socialism has much more in common with the way Europe approaches the role of the state and its responsibility in intervening in public life. It's much more about the government is responsible for providing for the social good. So it is interesting that China, who, given their situation, should have much more lax standards, in fact, patterns their standards after the EU, and in fact has much stricter standards. For example, in environmental regulation, China's regulations are far more strict than the US, though they don't always add up in reality to the outcomes that they're targeting. And I think that's due mainly to the commonalities between how both China and EU countries approach what regulation means for society.
So probably more of a state-centered control, maybe than politically aligned, if that makes sense.
I wouldn't say necessarily control, but the government is held responsible for the social good. Right. It's not considered the main impediment. If you think back to Ronald Reagan, right. It's always the government's fault. Right. The government is the reason, it is the obstacle to the social good. Well, that's the opposite view in China, and I think that's also um, pretty opposed to the general EU consensus, maybe minus Great Britain at this point.
This moment. Yes. And I guess to that point, my follow-up would be, can you get into a little bit of the political ethos of China? Because it's just, most of the canon we have in regulatory theory or governance tends to come from a little bit more of a Western or democratic perspective.
The China ethos in what way? You mean how they place themselves in
Yes,
the
and
global
what
system, or
I think everyone has a good idea of what a liberal system is supposed to work at, a market-driven system or a kind of liberal democracy. So what are the underlining premises that go into the current Chinese system of governance?
right. Yeah, so that's a difficult question. In fact, I would say, as far as so there was an interesting quote that came out of US intelligence and their difficulties in trying to figure out what the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, actually wants. It's in fact that they don't really know. And it's difficult. A lot of people will take indirect evidence and they'll infer. We don't know what Xi Jinping really wants. It could be that most of his policy is just dictated by maintaining domestic power, and that there's really no vision for China in the global order, or in fact there is a grand strategy and it's just being thwarted by the difficulties China has. I hesitate to try to give.
It's probably what I asked you is probably unfair in a dissertation in itself, but just a little bit of background.
It's difficult to say. What I will say is, just to add on to what I mentioned before, Deng Xiaoping predicted that there would be peace and it was a time for China to become prosperous.
Yeah.
Being prosperous means that China can be a great power, and that involves a lot of reactions to history. China was colonized. China, at least in its historical narrative, suffers from a lot of insult and injury at the hands of colonial powers. China doesn't want to be messed around with anymore. It sees itself as being a historical great power, and the fact that it wasn't for 200 years since colonization means that it was not in its rightful place. So that has been kind of built upon by Xi Jinping and his policy of what he calls national rejuvenation, which basically means the return of China to its rightful place. We talk about the rise of China. That narrative is really, it annoys the CCP. They don't consider it a rise, they consider it a return. And until you understand that China has always considered itself a great power, they're not rising. In fact, they got knocked down and they're standing back up. That implies a lot for the global order. China so far has not been a revisionist power. They've been working to maintain global institutions. In fact, they work very hard to integrate into things like the WHO, the IMF, the UN. They try to play by the rules as much as they can, except in very specific strategic things, like things that involve territorial security. But it's not guaranteed that they'll keep doing that. It's still an open question of whether China is going to be a revisionist power, try to change the global order, try to challenge US hegemony. We don't know. Recently, it seems like they're becoming more isolationist. The nationalist tendencies are being stoked even more than before, but China has a lot of problems. China has an aging population. China's birth rate is such that the population could decrease by 400 million by 2100. There's massive problems as China's shifting to a consumption-based economy. It's not clear that they can overcome what's often referred to as the middle income trap.
Right.
We just don't know at this point. It requires kind of daily observation to see. It's difficult to predict. But my advice for anybody involved in this area, or involved in an area where China might be a major factor, is to be open to seeing things from angles that are not typically Western, because the strategy is not being formulated in a purely Western rationale. There are other factors at play that might be important, and so relying on that typical Western analysis is potentially going to introduce some blind spots that may really mess you up.
Right. To that end, and you can, this is brief, I don't want you to get into every policy, but since this class is specifically on emerging tech and global governance, can you just speak for a couple minutes on how the role tech plays in their kind of agenda? I know they have quite a few initiatives in that, to that end.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so science and technology was the very first pillar of Deng Xiaoping's four modernization. So the four ways of becoming a great power, science and technology was a priority. So in emerging technology, the strategic control over emerging technology plays a very big role, because emerging technologies, specifically like AI, biotechnology, these things have been identified as core strategies of the party, which means that they can use any resources and any form of intervention in these industries to promote the synchronization of the technology with party and government strategy. And that goes beyond just, we're going to invest a lot in this. It goes to, we're going to identify the ways that these specific technologies can allow us to achieve our social and global political goals. So if you think about AI, surveillance comes to mind. The way AI is developing in China is not simply a matter of a free market and the free kind of free innovation where these things just pop up because they were supposed to pop up at that time. Like, they're specifically designed, the kind of boutique of these technologies is specifically designed to achieve the political goals of the party. And it will be that same way in biotechnology.
Right.
So I guess that's my short answer.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
That's about as short as I can keep it.
No, that's good. No, there's so many you can get into, but I just kind of wanted to lay the groundwork that it's pretty significant for them in their economy.
Oh, yeah.
So we talked a lot about kind of, we call it, maybe smart regulation or regulatory capitalism or soft law, but essentially kind of, as we've seen, international law is based a lot on what we call soft law mechanisms, right? Coercive rather than hard law, steering, not rowing. So are there any particular tools that you think matter more to China or more important to them? Like, which ones, is there any mechanisms you think for working with, or I hate to use the word control, but kind of, that, help, they want to, they're going to want to play ball and vice versa. So.
Yeah. So I think soft law, it's interesting because a lot of commentary around soft law is how it might be ineffective in dealing with China. And the reason that I think that's due to that kind of misconception is China is still a command economy, where in fact that's not true. The governing in China has been geared around principles that are very, very similar to soft law for the last 30 years. And it should be noted that they're pretty good at it.
Right.
In China, this is known as indicative planning. It's typically described this way, where the government is, the way it regulates is by the creation of an environment of incentives, not an environment of constraints. And this is very similar to the way soft law works. China is very effective at doing this because of factors that specifically soft law doesn't have. For example, China can create incentives to encourage certain types of behaviors, but it has a backup plan in state-owned stakes in its enterprises. And the way that works is basically like, we're going to incentivize certain types of behaviors, and we're going to encourage people playing by the rules based on creating that environment. However, if that doesn't happen the way we want it to, we own part of all these companies. And because we own part of all these companies, we station party members at all the companies. And so there's always a backup plan, and there's always a stick that's in the back of people's minds. So that's how it works domestically. But I think because of this regulatory history, China knows how to work with soft law. But on the other hand of that, China also knows what the limitations of soft law are. It knows how to be a free rider. It knows how to strategically break soft law, how to control and capture institutions, for example.
Right.
So it's not a given at the outset that soft law is going to be less workable with China. In fact, it might be very effective. But in the implementation of soft law frameworks, it always needs to be taken into account that China knows how to manipulate soft law as well as it knows how to implement it.
Right. Okay, that's really interesting. I also, one area, because we talked about the CRISPR babies, that I found interesting is that, getting published in Western journals is more important, and being taken as a credible source in science. So that actually, having backlash from like Nature or Cell becomes very useful, I guess, in biotech, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. So like we had discussed before, science and technology is integral to China's strategy. And part of that is being seen as a member of a borderless international society of scientists, right? Who are, we're searching for the truth. We're providing knowledge and information. And that's something that shouldn't be dictated by national political interests.
Right.
That's how they achieve knowledge and technology transfer, is continued access to this in a society of science. So by one particular scientist going too far and threatening access to this thing that is a core strategic priority explains a large part of the reaction to that type of action. So, and this is not going to stop anytime soon. Access to global science is something that is so prized within China that you're actually looked down upon if you publish too much in Chinese journals. If you don't have the English language publication, then it's just sometimes assumed that what you're doing is not on the forefront, because the forefront happens in this kind of republic of science, this kind of science's own world that it governs by itself.
So global credibility is important.
I mean, it's less about credibility than access.
Okay.
I think. I mean, Chinese scientists deal with a lot of issues of credibility because of legacy issues, false studies, politically influenced things. Like there's a lot of things that threaten credibility of Chinese science. But the peer-reviewed system seems to overcome that. As long as a team of Chinese scientists who can submit their paper to Nature and have it pass peer review seems to alleviate those concerns. So it's not as much about credibility as it is about maintaining access.
Yeah, I meant being seen as credible in those types of journals, like getting being published in Nature, as you say, like
Sure.
being on.
Sure, but I mean, even so, international science getting published in Nature, they do their best to project the fact that the origin of science doesn't matter, right? Science it's non-national.
Of course, yeah.
So the political, the political is supposed to be outside of those things. We know it's probably not that simple.
Right.
But yeah.
But those journals come with their own ethics guidelines often, so it can kind of become useful if that's the.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the Chinese regulatory environment is engineered specifically around things like ethics, around things like research regulations. Those things are typically written in light of the way things are done in, say, Nature.
Right.
Or other places. Like they have to demonstrate that what's happening domestically fits with what happens in international science in order to make it easier to access, to publish, to communicate, to have international cooperation. So, I mean, a lot of hospitals, a lot of biotech, they implement the strictest of bioethical standards. They not implement, they adopt the strictest of bioethical standards so that they can demonstrate during a partnership that they are not going to endanger the credibility of the projects that they're working on. Whether or not they're actually implemented properly and there's a way to enforce them is another issue. But often the shape of how the shape of the regulations that come out is really dictated by what do we need in order to maintain access. Regardless of if this fits with our cultural political ethos, this is a situation where access is much more important than fitting our local situation.
Perfect. So my last question, and this is why one of the reasons why I love working with you on projects is that when I started, as you know, my project is on neurotech and doing a comparative governance and regulation piece with US, EU, and China, is that I'm constantly met with people saying, well, China's just going to win. We're done. We're doomed. There's a lot of doom and gloom in that particular in those areas, especially with AI in general. So is there anything you could just say you think is maybe either overblown or maybe even underblown, like things we're missing and things we're hyper focused on? Because as I've started working, I don't agree with the doom and gloom scenario I get from a lot of other academics.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the doom and gloom is potentially about a false judgment about the advantages of doing research in China. The advantages are often described as things like, oh, well, the ethics aren't as strict, or that the law isn't mature, so you can kind of do what you want, or that there's a lot more space to use technologies in ways that we just can't do them in other places like the West. And these judgments, while in certain specific areas potentially present an advantages, the drawbacks might be even greater, and might attenuate what seem potentially as an advantage. I guess I couldn't be very strong either way about China's plan to dominate and why that might not be, in fact, doable, and they might not be successful in that. A lot of scholars comment on the fact that China is not a free society and ideas don't flow the way they do in the West, and that means China, as far as innovation, is always going to be at a disadvantage. I don't think that's entirely true, but I think that's very true in strategic sectors. Okay. So for example, in AI or biotechnology, discussions about what these technologies mean and how they can be used is very highly influenced by the fact that it's centrally administered. And so in these areas, that in fact may be sufficient to hold China back from being able to really innovate on the cutting edge. Ideas can't flow freely. You can't, as a junior researcher, typically challenge a senior researcher, and that creates problems of efficiency that will always handicap the innovation system that they have. That's typically noted, and that's not something that's not understood by the Chinese leadership either. In 2016, Xi Jinping gave a speech to a conference of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, where he basically identified the fact that China's innovation system is too rigid, and it's rigid because the senior researchers or the people in positions of power typically maintain their power by stifling innovation instead of promoting the innovation of their underlings. And he told the junior researchers, he said, if you understand the strategic importance of the thing you think you can innovate on, feel for, and not in these exact words, but feel free to challenge that system. That speech, by the way, was broadcast to all scientists in China, including JK of the CRISPR story, which could explain which could have emboldened what they were doing. So it's a problem that's been identified by China itself. It's one that I don't think has been solved. And it's one, ironically, through the CRISPR story that might have even become more serious. You see an example of an entrepreneurial take on emerging biotechnology. He goes out, he does his kind of novel experiment, one that the people over him would have said is illegal, and then he gets thrown in jail. And then what he was doing is banned. That could have an extreme chilling effect,
Right.
on innovation. It's not clear if that's actually going to happen or not, but that might just reinforce the rigid structure that Xi Jinping is well aware of. It's not exactly clear at this point how they plan to overcome it. In fact, Xi Jinping has taken a much tougher stance on technology companies, especially in information technology and internet companies, things like Tencent and Alibaba, in financial fintech companies. It seems like there's more of a crackdown, which would be antithetical to what he was saying before. So in fact, things are not looking as optimistic about China dominating what they actually plan to dominate in the future, but it's still early to tell.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been great. I'm sure everyone learned a lot. I think this was such a great piece too, because we're going to weave through the CRISPR babies in a few ways, just because obviously it was a pretty dramatic, from a global governance, it felt like, a pretty, kind of an earthquake moment. And so they'll actually get to hear from both of our mentor, Ben Hurlbut, in a few weeks, who actually was in correspondence with JK, I think up until he was arrested. So they'll also get a lot of that background too. So I really appreciate you offering the bit about China, as well as your personal relationship to the story.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you
for
so
having me.
much. And let's stop.